Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions tonight. The member for Fairfax and leader of the Palmer United Party, Clive Palmer. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Christian Porter. Actor, playwright and star of black comedy, Nakkiah Louis. Political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review, Jennifer Hewett. And the Shadow Minister for Communications, Jason Clare. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. And our Facebook audience suggested we talk about Maurice Newman's claims of a UN conspiracy on climate change. Well, we'll try to get to that later. Our first question tonight comes from Robert Ward.
My question is, so the political commentator Nakkiah Burns described Joe Hockey as being sad, depressed and deflated. How does the budget affect the future of Joe Hockey's career?
Jennifer Hewett.
Well, he didn't look too happy, I must say, but he was trying again today to look a little bit happier as he sold what he was going to do on multinational tax arrangements. The thing for Joe Hockey at the moment is that he's under huge pressure. Everyone knows that the budget last year was incredibly unpopular with the public. That created all sorts of problems for the government, which are still continuing. And now, of course, he's in a situation where the economy is still struggling. There are still all sorts of issues. So it's not as though he can go out and be Santa Claus and give people lots of money to make people feel better about the budget. And so there's a lot of questions about his future. Even a lot of his Liberal colleagues want Tony Abbott to replace him. So in many ways, it's not that surprising that he was looking a little bit depressed the other day.
Jennifer, not made any easier for him by the fact the Social Services Minister, Scott Morrison, has announced prior to the budget what appear to be two of the biggest budget measures.
Well, that's right.
Is he breathing down his neck?
Well, Scott Morrison has not only announced the budget measures, he's also been able to sell them in a much more kind of persuasive and I think coherent way. And of course they are more specific than the general economy that a treasurer has to look after. But I think that that's the comparison that people want. And of course the interesting thing about Scott Morrison is that even when Malcolm Turnbull was trying to become Prime Minister, although we weren't allowed to say that and he certainly wasn't saying it, he also wanted Scott Morrison as Treasurer. So there's no doubt that Hockey is under enormous pressure for tomorrow, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out in the next few weeks.
Jason Clare.
Well, he is under a lot of pressure, and Tony Abbott's under a lot of pressure tomorrow night as well. The budget week's important. It sets a vision for what the country's going to look like for the next 4 years and beyond. And last year, the vision that the government painted was pretty awful. They said that as part of the budget, we had to get sick people to pay more, that students had to pay more, that pensioners were going to get less. It wasn't just the Labor Party who thought that was a bad idea. The whole country thought that was a bad idea. Put your hand up if you think that last year's budget was a good one. 2. So that's the pressure that...
There was another guy up the back.
That's the sort of pressure. 3.
He didn't have his hand up.
You didn't have your hand up.
I didn't know I was allowed.
You can finish that point and we'll come to Christian Porter.
Now you can understand why Joe Hockey's under a lot of pressure tomorrow night.
You didn't have your hand up, Christian Porter.
Oh, you never said I was allowed to do that.
I'll say you're allowed. Now you put it up very high if you really believe last year's budget was good.
Well, I think last year's budget achieved some important things. And if you look at what the IGR report said about the sort of future trajectory, had we not managed to do some of the things that we did in last year's budget, we'd be in a far worse place than we are now. And the place that we're in now isn't perfect by any stretch. However, we were left debt and deficit, we were left a spending trajectory which meant that had all of Labor's spending promises been generated through years of the budget, that you would have had to have increased the tax take in Australia by 50% to meet them.
OK, well, I'm going to bring you back to the question, the idea that Joe Hockey looks sad, deflated and depressed. What do you say to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, questions like that. I mean, as a politician, I've delivered budgets at a state level and I've seen people deliver Labor budgets and Liberal budgets. I don't think that treasurers or any politicians thinking, how is this going to affect my career? I think they are genuinely trying to see their way through what are often very complicated scenarios. For instance, Joe Hockey's now facing a situation where the iron ore price has halved since the time of the last budget, which was most unexpected, which has a massive flow-on effect through revenue write-downs over the out years and over a 10-year period. So I think that Joe Hockey will deliver an excellent budget. I heard a media commentator say, well, you can't win because if it's a great budget, Scott Morrison will get the credit, and if it's a bad budget, Joe Hockey will take the blame. Well, you can win, and you can win if it's a good budget, and I'm sure it will be.
Very briefly, Scott Morrison, is he one of those complicated scenarios that was faced by the Treasurer?
No, I can honestly say to you, this is not what actually happens inside a government, a cabinet, and ERC who are putting a budget together. Like, these sort of personality issues are just not on the table.
Clive Palmer.
Well, I think the budget will be about last year's budget. I think you'll see it repackaged. There'll be a lot of positive measures and say, well, we can only pay for it if we can do some of the things we wanted to do last year to balance the budget. So I don't think the Liberal Party has really given up on what its real agenda is, which it showed to Australia last year. And that's what I think is really going to happen. Like this thing we've seen about paid parental leave. We can do paid parental leave, but you'll have to let us do some of the things we wanted to do last year. That's not what Australia needs. We need good, clear, concise policies that don't worry about just taxes and services, but worry about growth, creating jobs and a future for this country and a vision. Unfortunately, I don't think the Prime Minister and his team's got the vision we need for Australia.
Nakkiah.
Well, yeah, I'd look pretty depressed too. I guess the old saying is, what does the government hate more than deficits? And that's collecting the revenue to pay the deficit. And, you know, this current budget they're putting forth is a bit like puree. It's a bit of everything and it just tastes weird, which isn't a metaphor that I thought out very correctly. But that's what I'm saying, it's a bit of everything. They've spent the last 5 years preaching austerity, telling us that living beyond our means is bad, telling us that it's wrong to borrow, government borrowing is wrong, yet now they're telling us we need to kickstart the economy and start spending. That's not our job, that's the government's job.
Let's move on to a whole bunch of other questions on the budget. The first one is from Matthew Taylor.
The government has announced its intention to tighten the age pension assets test, but will continue to ignore pensioners' biggest asset, the family home. This exemption is unfair. It provides the same pension payments to those who have chosen to place most of their wealth in housing as it does to those who have nothing. Last year, Labor and the Greens derided the budget for being unfair. But how is it fair to use the taxes of low-income households to subsidise inheritances that will go to high-income ones?
Christian Porter, we'll start with you.
Also, you've mentioned what's going to be in the budget with respect to pensions. And what the government is trying to do is what you suggest, make a fairer system. Now, the pension, we take a view, is unsustainable in its present form. So it's going to increase by 70% over a decade, the payments going out. It's in a sense, it harks back to a time when the pension age was set at 65, the average male life expectancy was 55. People who now receive the pension can expect to receive it for 20 years. Now, you've made the point about the family home. What has happened in this budget is that those people who own a family home, which, as you point out, can be of unlimited value, a certain subset of all pension recipients can also have very large amounts of assets. So a couple with a family home of unlimited value can also have $1.15 million worth of assets and receive a part pension. Now, obviously, you'd like for any government to go further than what this government has done, but what this government has done is said that situation where unlimited value home ownership plus $1.15 million worth of cash assets is not the sort of person that in these circumstances, when there are difficulties and with an unsustainable pension, should be receiving a part pension.
I'll just go back to our questioner, if I can, Christian. And, yeah, Matt Taylor, the family home has been sacrosanct as far as both sides of politics are concerned. What makes you think that should change?
Well, there's approximately $625 billion in pensioner home equity. If that could be converted into an income, we could tighten up the assets test, potentially save billions of dollars in pension payments. But we could also treat homeowners and non-homeowners the same and sort of remove the current inequities in the age pension means test. We could have we could have less pension spending, but also a fairer pension means test.
Christian Porter, was it even considered?
Home ownership is not something that we're looking at or touching. But we have made, I think, a very important step, which is to say that there are subsets of pensioners who have very large assets tied up in their home, plus large amounts of cash liquid assets who are receiving a part pension, who we say should no longer receive that part pension, and the money needs to be redirected to those people with low assets, which we will do. So the overwhelming majority of pensioners will be better off under the system that we're proposing. Those pensioners that will find themselves going off the part pension, we've calculated will only need to draw down on their assets to the tune of about 1.8% per year. to maintain the same level of income as they were previously maintained on. So look, we think this is a very big step forward in equity or fairness, if you like. You'd like us to go further. We're not going towards the family.
Let's hear equity and fairness. It sounds, in some respects, Jason Clare, like a Labor Party or Labor government measure. I mean, are you going to support it?
Well, the question is it fair for elderly people to have to sell their home in order to survive? I was talking to somebody the other day who told me, look, it would mean that I would have to move out of my home. This is where all my friends are. This is where my network of neighbours and friends are. It wouldn't be something they'd want to do.
But they need to move out of the home. I mean, they could enter into a reverse mortgage, convert that equity into an income, and they could remain there for as long as they choose.
Sure,
the government could.
You're springing it on people who've made decisions through the course of their life about how they want to retire. As opposed to that, you know, Christian's talking about people who are on a part pension. Labor's put forward a proposition that says that if someone has about, in addition to their family home, they might have $1.5 million in superannuation. They're making about $75,000 every year in interest on that. At the moment, they pay no tax on that interest. We've said, look, it makes sense, it's sensible for them to be paying some tax on the dollars they earn over $75,000. And when you compare that to somebody who's earning $75,000 a year, there'd be some people like that in the audience. It's about the average income in Australia. You pay 32.5 cents in the dollar, marginal tax rate on $75,000 a year. What we're saying is, if you earn that in interest once you're in retirement age, then you won't pay any tax on the first $75,000 in interest you earn, but we'll pay a small amount of tax after that. That can go back to the budget or help to fund other programs.
OK, now, obviously, you take the kind of philosophical view that people have too much money to be given tax-free status on their superannuation. What about the people who have more than $1 million in the bank and can still draw a part pension while owning a home?
Yeah,
are you going to support that measure?
We're going to have a good look at it.
Right. So you're not rejecting
we're not
the
ruling it out.
Measure.
We're going to go through the process we should do of analysing it and seeing whether it stacks up or not. It seems on its face fairer or better than what the government was proposing last year, which was that effectively all pensioners get an $80 a week tax cut. But Clive's right. This is option B. It's not option A. The real agenda that the government wants to pursue is to cut the pension. And if they win the next election and get control of the Senate, you can bet that they'll try it on again.
All right, Jennifer Hewett.
Well, as you can hear from both Christian and Jason, this is incredibly complicated and there's very, very prickly politics involved. And I think most people get rather confused about, you know, all the details of what both parties are suggesting. And they look at it through the overall issue of fairness and also what can people reasonably expect. And what is obvious, I think, is that the family home, for the moment, is off limits to both sides. Now, maybe in future years they'll think about grandfathering something like that in. A lot of experts think that's going to be the only way, but now there's just no way it's going to happen. In terms of what Labor's suggesting about superannuation concessions and taxing that, again, it's always a lot more complicated than it sounds. Labor, in fact, tried to do a similar thing when they were in government and it was Treasury decided it was unimplementable. In terms of what the government's doing with pension payments, yes, I think they've made a much more sensible version. I think that's why Scott Morrison's been quite clever in saying we're not going to have the assets test as generous when you can still be eligible for the part pension. But there's still going to be losers with that as well. And I just think the whole area demonstrates the fact that people haven't come to terms with the budget reality that we can't just keep on spending on all the things we'd like to spend on.
We've got a Twitter question that's just come in from Amber Wilkie, or at Amber Wilkie. Why demonise pensions and ignore the inequality of the super system? And we'll obviously take that to the government.
Well, and going back to the point about whether the government's secret agenda is to cut pensions. Look, under this plan, no full pensioner loses $1. 170,000 part pensioners receive $30 more a fortnight, and 50,000 part pensioners would now qualify for the full pension. And yes, there are people with high assets who find themselves at a slight disadvantage because of this policy, but a disadvantage that only requires them to draw down on their super at 1.8%. On the question of taxing super, I mean,
which for some reason you've rejected. Tell us why.
I think the basic reason is this, is that the whole point about super...
It isn't really taxing super, is it? It's taxing super at the highest end.
Well, it's taxing the earnings off super if they're over $75,000. Now, you might describe that as the higher end, except that it's not indexed under the Labor plan, so it will capture more and more people over time. 75,000 off your super is not a massive amount. But I think more fundamentally, if the pension payments are unsustainable, which we say that they are, and which I think now the debate has moved on to accept that they are, there are three things that you can do. You can borrow more money when you're in debt and deficit, which we inherited, to pay for increasing pension requirements. You can tax super or the earnings off super, or you can somehow restrain the growth in the pension over time, which is the plan that we've come up with. The fundamental reason why we say you shouldn't tax super is that the whole point of superannuation was that in time, the tax concessions that are allowed for people, which encourage them to put money into super, means that effectively the retiree that builds up their super and can go off the pension system pays back that benefit in time by not accessing the taxpayer-funded pension, which is why we say our program and plan is a better one, because we are going to the root of the problem, which is to try to slow down that growth, which has been explosive in pension payments over a longer period of time.
Let's hear Clive Palmer wants to get in on that.
Well, I think it's a bit of a farce, the whole thing. You know, 50% of Australians die before they ever draw down their super. And that's a telling statistic, isn't it, really? And with the government, we all know the government wanted to increase the pension age to 70. Our policy is that if we're going to increase the pension age to 70, we should make that the same age that the parliamentarians get their superannuation entitlements in Parliament. And that's the only way I can think of bringing the pension age down to 39.
Nakkiah, let me bring you in.
Well, my question is, what about my generation? What about the people who are saving and paying their taxes for their pension in the future? And the fact is, the reason the thresholds were unsustainable is because the tax concessions were growing faster than the age pension, and the threshold couldn't sustain it. You would need I think it is $100 million super balance with the current bonds at 2 to 2.3% for people to get half the pension in the future. So you're making these predictions on the assumption that the bonds will go back to 6%. My generation isn't going to have, even with that $100 million super balance, there isn't going to be, there won't be the half the cost of the pension there. So my question is, what about that generation? We're leaving a generation behind.
So when I was...
You're still not cut, like this, anyway.
When I was born in 1970, there were about 7.5 taxpayers to every pensioner, person of retirement age. And then in about 2009, that ratio was 5 to 1, and we're heading to about 2.6 to 1. Now, quite often when I speak with pensioners, you do hear this phrase that people pay their taxes through their life to earn their pension later on. What actually happens in a structural sense in an economy is that all the taxpayers now, those 7 to 1 or 5 to 1 or 2.6 to 1, are paying taxes to allow a pension to be paid. And if you can't slow down the rate of growth in the pension and that you don't have a plan to slow down that rate of growth, or you don't have a plan to earn extra revenue, you're effectively borrowing more and more to pay the pension, which means that grandkids of today, when they enter the tax system, will be paying back those borrowings through increased tax and basically funding pension increases today. So it's this generation of taxpayers that are paying for this generation of pensions, and it'll be the next that'll pay for the next. And that's the structural...
Briefly, Clive.
Well, when you were born, we didn't have compulsory superannuation. We've got that now. We've now got the 4th largest superannuation pool in the world, and our trajectory is that our superannuation pool will be $7.9 trillion by 2030. And that's more than enough to pay for all our retirement people. The Labor Party has got a policy, a 3-pronged policy of dealing with super, pensions. I've forgotten what the other one was, but that was, you know, it's not just looking at the pension.
Getting elected, I think.
You know, it's not just looking at the pension as the be-all and end-all. You know, there's too much focus on taxes and services and what the government will do for you. The critical questions facing our country today is what we can do for ourselves and how we can look ahead, like President Obama's done in the States with growth policies, and Europe's doing. Yeah. We're going like Greece at the moment.
All right, so the whole issue of productivity has been raised. That's also an issue in the childcare debate that's going on at the moment. The next question is a video from Jane Tyndall in North Lakes, Queensland.
Why does the government keep encouraging young mothers to return to work quickly and at the same time continue to hand out large subsidies in the form of childcare? In this debate, nobody thinks about the children, who are the biggest losers here. Stay-at-home mothers should be encouraged to stay at home and supported. Otherwise, we will have big social problems in the future.
I'm tempted to say I'll take that as a comment, but instead I'll pass it to Jennifer.
Thank you. I think this is a big area, and obviously some people, including in the government and the National Party, think much the same way. But I think the other problem is with not helping people to go back to work or mothers to go back to work, at least part-time, is that the economy just can't sustain it, and their own household budgets can't sustain it. And certainly, as everybody would know who lives in Sydney, it's very hard to kind of sustain a mortgage on one income. So I think the thing to do is to make it as flexible as possible, and clearly if people can stay home with their kids and want to do that, that's great. But for an awful lot of people, it should just be made as easy as possible, and it's always still hard to spend to at least work part-time.
All right, so what about the changes that Scott Morrison is talking about? Because actually they make it harder for people on single incomes, don't they?
Well, they make it harder, except for people who are socially disadvantaged. There's still a bit of a safety net like that. But yeah, the whole purpose of this is to encourage people who, as Morrison says, who need to go back to work to try and make that possible. For people who are not, it's going to be just one income, yes, they're going to find it much harder to pay for the childcare. They won't get the same subsidies, and that is going to be difficult. But you know, I think it's just one of those things that people have to decide how they're going to live their lives.
I think people has been calculated like this by the analysts. If you've got a salary between $100,000 and $150,000 and a single breadwinner, then you're going to lose family tax benefit Part B, which is a loss of $4,274 a year. And on top of that, you won't be able to get subsidised childcare, not at the same level anyway.
Yes, and I think that's going to be the very tricky politics of it. And I think the government's already kind of suggesting that they're going to be prepared to compromise on this with people in the Senate. And I think that they may have to do that. But you could still come back to the point that there has to be savings made somewhere. So maybe this is not the perfect option. But I mean, I think what the Labor Party has continued to do is to say this is terribly unfair and we wouldn't allow this, and we mustn't be so mean to people. But they have not come up with the idea of alternative savings at all. All
right, before I go to the politicians, let's hear from Nakkiah.
Well, yeah, I think we need to remember that when we talk about family spending and childcare, we're actually talking about children, you know, and that's why do we punish the children? I would think that the fact is that this $800 million package for childcare is basically a smokescreen for $8 billion worth of cuts to family spending. You know, I'm no economist, and I'll try and do the math. I mean, I'm a sketch writer here, but that's where's the other $4.2 billion. I was raised by a single mother. You know, I don't know if I would be where I am had my mother not had those benefits that we're taking away from people. I don't see why we're punishing the middle to lower class for these decisions. Find the savings somewhere else. It's not a matter of just making it work. We're talking about children's futures. Just find the savings somewhere else.
Clive Palmer, you at least... You've still got one senator in your Palmer United Party. You had a little bit more powerful a short time ago. But what do you think will happen?
Future, Tony.
What do you think? These measures, obviously, the core funding measure of this is held up in the Senate.
It's a silly debate, really. The real debate should be about getting more jobs. There's no jobs for all of these people to go to. People think that they'll go back to work and join the workforce. Well, if there's no jobs, how can they? We've got to get our economy moving again. We've got to get growth strategies and we've got to stimulate demand.
But I might just get you to stick to the childcare policy for a minute, because critically, in order to fund it, you've got to get through the Senate previous measures, which are blocked in the Senate. So a deal has to be done. Will the senators agree to it?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think they'll agree to that. And this is what I was saying. This is Scott Morrison went out to sell these measures to get everyone excited so that Joe Hockey can announce the bad news, good guy, bad cop, that the school kids' bonus is under threat, that low-income super will have to be abolished for 3 million Australians, that low-income support will be finished with, and then they'll start on the $10 billion that the government's tried to take last year for the people on Struggle Street. That's what it boils down to. And this is all about spin, you know, making people believe that they're getting better off when they're really getting worse off. And that's what I think will be uncovered. And I certainly will be looking forward to uncovering it, lifting the veil on what's really happening. I'm sure the Labor Party will be too.
Christian Porter.
So what the government's proposing to do is, and at the moment the taxpayer, through the Commonwealth Government, spends $7 billion a year subsidising childcare. Right? we're proposing that an additional $3.5 billion be expended, but that the focus be on enabling and incentivising mothers to return to work. Now, the original question basically posed in not too subtle terms that somehow or other problems for children were caused by that scenario. Now, the reality is the overwhelming number of families have mothers that choose to return to work, and I think that young women want that choice in their life when they have children. So this is unashamedly a productivity measure. And when you hear questions like that, which basically put this view that somehow nothing is being done for stay-at-home mums. Now, keep in mind that we spend $7 billion a year on subsidising childcare.
Can I just interrupt just to ask, is this essentially having the argument here now which you're having in the party room or in the coalition room with your National Party colleagues? Because they're the ones who are screaming loudest about stay-at-home mums being penalised.
Well, there was one National Party senator today who made some comments, but of course the National Party voted for all of the changes to family tax benefit that we proposed last year. But the point is this, is that family tax benefits are $20 billion a year that go from the taxpayer to families. There's no activity test for those. Whether you're a stay-at-home parent or a working parent, you receive those payments, $20 billion a year. Now, what we say is that subsidies for childcare shouldn't be just merely about a pure welfarist outcome. They should also be a productivity measure designed to incentivise women back into the workforce once they've had children. That's good for the country, it's good for the families, and we say that that is a productivity measure that's very important for Australia's long-term economic growth.
But Clive Palmer raises the issue that effectively this is a smokescreen for getting through measures which are already stuck in the Senate, which would raise $10 billion and, of course, make big changes to these family tax benefit arrangements. So why do you have to link those two things together if the principle is so important?
I mean, as I said earlier, when you inherit debt and deficit, which we did, if you have new spending, there are three ways to pay for it. New taxes, finding other savings in the budget to reprioritise your spending, or going further into debt. Now, we are not about new taxes. We're not about going further into debt. And Nakkiah, I know you say find other savings. $3.5 billion worth of savings is actually not that simple a task to perform. So what we say is that all of these extra spending measures, if you are to recalibrate and refocus and try and engender a productivity gain from a payment like childcare subsidies, then you should find savings inside the budget. And we have identified those savings, and they are with respect to modest changes to family tax benefits at the moment, which represent $20 billion a year, going from taxpayers to families.
Can you explain what happens to single-parent households? Because ACOS is saying they're going to lose $60 a week.
Well, the activity test is this. 8 hours minimum a fortnight of work will allow you to receive the subsidy for 36 hours care. 17 hours a fortnight work allow you 72 hours subsidised care. 49 hours a fortnight allows you 100 hours care. And that minimum 8 hours of activity in a fortnight is a very modest target. It's a hurdle which is very modest. The activity includes employment, unpaid work in a family business, looking for work, home business, study, further education. So we're trying to incentivise that behaviour. And when the Productivity Commission looked at this, they noted that 165,000 said that the present arrangements are disincentivising their return to work. And if the arrangements changed and there was a greater subsidy going to those people that return to work,
Christian,
they'd be incentivised to go to work.
We've got to move on because we've got other questions. I just have to hear from Jason Clare on this.
Well, I think the problem is this: you shouldn't have to take money off low-income families in order to improve childcare. And as Clive made the point again, they've chained a good idea to a bad idea. Childcare is expensive. There's a disincentive for a lot of mums and dads to return to work because after you get your salary, there's not much left over after you pay the childcare bill. So if we can encourage people to go back to work through incentives in childcare, then terrific. That's a good thing. That'll improve participation. That Christian was talking about.
So if it weren't for the way that it was costed, in principle, you'd agree with this, would you?
We'd have to go through the detail of it, but it's giving extra funds to families to encourage them to go back to work. There's a whole bucket of money for people who earn more than, I think it's $180,000 or $200,000, upping it to $10,000.
That's a cap.
That's a cap. Yeah. But on its face, I'm thinking, why are you taking $6,500 a year off a family that lives off $65,000 a year with 2 kids at school in order to give $10,000 in childcare benefits to someone on $250,000 or $500,000 a year. They don't need it. They don't need that as an incentive to go back to work because they're earning $250,000 or $500,000 already. So they need to do a bit more work on this.
We've got other questions. We're going to go to another one on a slightly different subject from Lara Sonnenschein.
Clive, you've recently achieved a significant win in the courts against Chinese mining company CITIC. However, your political influence has suffered with both Jackie Lambie and Glenn Lazarus resigning from your party. With the benefit of hindsight, would you have spent the money you did establishing your party? Or would it have been better to keep your membership with the Liberal Party and exert your influence as a member of the LNP?
Will you give me 2 minutes to answer that, Tim?
Well, I don't know about 2 minutes, but certainly I'll give you time to answer it.
Well, you've got to say, was it worth stopping the co-payment, stopping the changes to the university, stopping $10 billion of cuts to the people on Struggle Street? Was it worth freeing 436 children from Christmas Island, 1,500 adults from Christmas Island? Was it worth resolving and freeing from detention 30,000 people, introducing the safe haven visas, saving the low-income super for 2 million Australians, keeping the school kids bonus, keeping low-income support, reducing electricity prices in Australia by 10%, making 15 changes to direct action to see it get through the Senate and finally start to work in this country, to save the Climate Change Authority, save the Clean Energy Corporation, save ARENA, save the RET, fix pensions for veterans over 55, stop Campbell Newman in the Queensland government, setting up 3 inquiries
Clive,
in the
this
Senate.
is not a campaign advertisement. As impressive as the list is on the face of it.
Well, of course it was worth it.
Yeah.
Of course it was worth it,
Yeah.
because it's not about how many members you've got in Parliament or ideas. It's about serving the community and having an outcome. That's what politics should be about.
Yeah, but it's slightly embarrassing when you start losing the people that you got into Parliament in the first place, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think you've got to realise that we were in the balance of power in Australia. We had enormous pressures on us by people like News Limited, who are the #1 tax avoiders on the list for the Australian Taxation Department for ripping off the Australian people. And every day you'll read 16 or 17 articles about me in the press, which are all not true. And you'll see the court judgment of the Queensland Supreme Court saying it was utter rubbish. But, you know, that's the sort of pressure that I can handle because I'm experienced in business. Theo Wang can handle it. But for normal Australians, which Jackie Lambie and Glenn Lazarus was, going into that situation, having people and lobbyists call on them day after day, trying to grind them down to desert the poor people of Australia, you know, we've got to expect some of us are going to buckle. But I'm not going to, and neither is Theo Wang. And we're going to expose this budget tomorrow for what it is, just spin, trying to get through the same things they were trying to get through last year.
OK, let's move to another question. We probably have spent 2 hours cross-examining Clive on some of those issues.
I've got more here.
Yeah, I'm sure you have, but we've got another big issue for our audience this week. It comes from, the question comes from Joanna Larkin.
I'm here with 20 students from a school in Mount Druitt, Loyola Senior High School. Last Wednesday, SBS aired the documentary Struggle Street on the issues in Mount Druitt. As people living in the community, we were appalled at the elitism and disconnected privilege shown by SBS, which showed the community without an understanding of its context and without the informed consent of the participants. We therefore ask, is all coverage good coverage? When does our personal stories become the ownership of the media?
Well said, Nakkiah Louis. Now, thank you very much. Well-expressed question. And Nakkiah, you actually were brought up in Mount Druitt, so give us your impressions of the documentary.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That was really well articulated. It makes me proud to be a Mount Druitt girl. I know Loyola, they used to be our nemesis school. That's a really good question. I had the same thoughts. What is the price of exposure? I mean, for many people, the level of poverty that exists within Mount Druitt was really unfamiliar. But then, when looking at, you know, I was reading my Twitter as I watched the show, and the mocking and vilification of people who just didn't have a fair go like the rest of the country. For me, it was like, what is the price? And is a documentary effective when there is that much room for misinterpretation for the subjects to be mocked and vilified? I think, though, we still have to watch the last 2 hours. For me, myself, you know, watching that poverty depicted wasn't unfamiliar. I know somebody made a joke about, on Twitter, there's a tarp over the washing line, so there must be a wedding. Yeah, great, right? Thanks, Australia. And you know, I've seen tarps on the washing lines. That being said, what did concern me was the missing representation of the working class. You know, the fact that you can be engaged in the workforce and still be struggling and still be caught in the poverty cycle, and that there are many people working who are one step away from going into the welfare cycle or have just left it. And I think that that was quite irresponsible by the filmmakers to not include that aspect of Mount Druitt.
Did you consider it to be poverty porn? That's the expression that's been used to describe this documentary.
I think that question comes down to the subjects of it. And when you have subjects saying that that is not an accurate depiction of us, then yes, it does fall into poverty porn because they do not have ownership over that representation. As a writer and as an actor, ownership over my representation, my ability to tell my own story is what is empowering. The fact that SBS had a 2-hour meeting with subjects, and I think it was the Mayor of Blacktown, I may be wrong in this, I had a 2-hour meeting prior to the showing of the airing of the show, and they still didn't show the subjects the documentary at that point. For me, that's worrying. The one thing we can say about Struggle Street is that this is a community that has been let down by its government. You know, and it's rather ironic that we have Struggle Street showing this week, that we have the budget being announced, when we had our Prime Minister come out and say $185,000 is roughing it. The subjects of this documentary are living on less than 10% of that. How disconnected is that? Do we have a government that is disconnected, or is it cruel? I'm not too sure. I think if we can have a worthwhile, engaged conversation about poverty, whether or not, you know, you're living on welfare or whether you're engaged in the workforce, whether you're from Western Sydney or another outer suburb, I think that's the best thing that can come out of Struggle Street.
Let's go back to our questioner. Joanna, when you saw it, what went through your head when you were watching the film? Well, I suppose you first would have seen it with the promo, which is almost the most outrageous thing, but the actual story, when you saw the documentary, you saw these people's lives unfold, did you recognise them? I mean, are they part of your community? Do you see that?
Definitely see it in the community, but it's a very limited portrayal. Like, we saw little snippets in the shopping centre where just a few metres away is the library with heaps of community facilities and the women's self-help house. And they deliberately chose not to show the positive parts of Mount Druitt because they wanted to sensationalise it and make it that kind of poverty porn. So it wasn't so much that, like, we recognised the stories within the community, but it's that they didn't show that working class and the positive parts of Mount Druitt to try and make us, you know, dehumanise us.
Jennifer, what did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was an incredibly lopsided show, and I thought, you know, whatever description you want to use, poverty porn or something like that, but I actually thought it was all those things. It was kind of condescending. Obviously, you know, there are families in trouble. There are in all sorts of areas. There's a lot of them in Mount Druitt. There's lots of them in other parts of Sydney as well, and I just found that at the end it was just as if they went out and kind of looked for talent. For example, an Indigenous guy who lives in the bush, you could feel a British producer going, wow, that's great talent, and look, he, you know, shoots birds with his you know, and to eat, and that'll be great TV. Whereas I don't think there was any explanation of the context, as you said, of what's going on, or of the other side of Mount Druitt and many other areas, you know, that have lots of high areas of poverty, and so I think the whole thing was a big negative, and sure, I agree that the promo was probably the worst part of it, and there was, but in general, actually, I thought it was a very bad show. But what I don't agree with is the idea that, as in journalism, in documentaries, you end up with having the people who can have actual control of what should be on air, because sometimes, you know, that doesn't work. As a journalist, every day I make choices about what I have to, you know, put in the paper or things that I choose, and that's part of the element of journalism, but that's where you can make a judgment about the quality of that journalism.
I suppose it assumes that what we're seeing there is journalism, not just some sort of perverse form of entertainment.
Well, yes, it was kind of a reality TV, but I think a very poor showing of it.
We've got another question on the subject. I'll go to that, and somewhere in the audience is the Mayor of Blacktown as well, so I'd like to hear from him. He's there. First of all, let's hear from Margaret Bell, who's got a question.
Yes, I'd like to say that the program was disgusting, to put my position forward. I've worked for 12 years in Mount Druitt with people who are extremely disadvantaged. I think that all those socioeconomic environments need education and jobs. And both sides of Parliament are always banging on about jobs and getting kids back to school. So my question is, why then is the government defunding the very organisations? There are two statements that are constantly made by both government and opposition, and that is education for kids and closing the gap. Our organisation and many others are doing exactly that, and we will be defunded from the end of June. So I can't see any sincerity in all of this. I think that certainly people didn't need to see a program that cost $1 million for entertainment or whatever it was supposed to be. It would be an insult to call it a documentary. Let's
go to the government, Christian Porter, on this issue of the defunding of the organisations in your community. You would like to respond to that, I imagine?
Look, I hated it as well, and I think it's a salutary lesson for all of those living through
You hated the cuts?
I hated the show. I'll get to that other issue. It's a salutary lesson for all of us living through the Facebook and reality TV era that not all publicity is good publicity, and certainly if I were a young person today, I'd be very cautious about handing my life over to that sort of level of scrutiny. You will never come out of it happily, I think. And I don't think those people were treated very well. I think looking at a show that focuses on absolute extremes, in this case extreme poverty, or indeed Australia's fascination with extreme wealth, is not a very good way or balanced way in which to try and make policy judgments about what's working or what's not working. And you could be easily left from an impression to that show that somehow Australia is a very stingy country when it comes to welfare and the transfer of income and in its efforts to try and help people. But when you actually look at the data about Australia and Australian government, I mean, we have, according to the OECD, the greatest redistribution from taxpayers to tax receivers of any country in the world. David Murray wrote
Christian,
last year...
any country in the world, probably a good point to bring our questioner back in, because I can see you shaking your head there.
I'd like to know, as the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Secretary, will you fight to have funding returned to the organisations that are closing the gap and getting kids back to school?
How many organisations are we talking about, Margaret?
I beg your pardon?
How many organisations are we talking about?
We're talking about at least half a dozen organisations in Mount Druitt itself.
That
and
do
there
what,
would be many others.
That do what?
To do what?
What do those organisations do?
I can speak specifically about Mount Druitt Learning Ground, which spends its time entirely in closing the gap and in getting kids back to school. We've got 188 kids of the most disadvantaged families that you can possibly imagine getting back to school in the last 4 years. Kids who've been school refusers and who've been under chronic suspension and who are now doing very well. And that funding will go at the end of June, and it's wicked.
All right. Wicked is the description.
Yeah,
of that.
I'm not an expert on that level of detail of the funding in Mount Druitt. What I do understand is
But will you make yourself an expert in it? Because you can hear the passion here.
I do hear the passion, but what I do understand broadly was that that organisation and many organisations went through a competitive tender process for what is a large sum of money,
that's right.
and some organisations were unsuccessful and some organisations were successful. And from time to time, those sort of competitive tender processes are actually very healthy processes to make sure that taxpayer funds...
Christian, there's a few people shaking their heads there, and I'll just go to the gentleman with his hand.
Was what?
Okay, go ahead.
Youth Connections was what? There's no retender, there's no replacement. When we've spoken to you people and you people, I say that pretty disrespectfully, I don't mean to, state and federal level, and there's no replacement.
Yeah.
And I met Margaret tonight. She's the next suburb over from where our program is. We deal with similar numbers. I met her tonight. So we're typically that busy on the ground that we don't even know the lady next door doing the same thing.
And briefly, Youth Connection deals with young people trying to get jobs.
Well, it used to, yeah. No, it used to provide that and also alternative education settings. So an opportunity for those who are not surviving in the mainstream setting to still have an opportunity in a very, very different setting.
All right, I'm just going to interrupt you there. Sorry, we might come back to you, but I just want to hear from our other politicians. Yeah. Jason Clare.
That's a great question. Just first on the show, when I watched the show, I saw people that were dealing with mental illness, unemployment, alcohol problems and drug abuse. And I thought to myself, this isn't unique to any part of Sydney or Australia. You could see it if you walk out of this studio within 5 minutes. And so my worry with the show is that it stigmatises one place, one suburb, and Mount Druitt suffered from that in the past. Anyone from Mount Druitt knows that. I'm from down around the corner at Cabramatta. And SBS did a show about Cabramatta a couple of years ago too, and my criticism of that was it told the story of the problems of heroin and drugs. It didn't tell the story about the success and how things have turned around. Lots of programs have been cut, including Youth Connections, which you saw on the program. Emergency relief has been cut as well. That's the sort of money that if people need a $20 Woolies voucher because they can't feed their kids, or money for blankets or nappies. I've got organisations in my community that have been doing it for 50 years and it's just been cut. 250 million has been ripped out of that, and people will suffer as a result of that. On education, because we're talking about what's happening now long term, education is the key. One of the things you find in a lot of our communities is a drop in low-skilled jobs. It's a trend that's been happening for a long time. It's only going to continue. There are going to be fewer jobs with low skills. That's why we need more and more people to finish school. We set ourselves a target of 90% across the country to finish school. But funny enough, you go to some suburbs and you'll find it's 100%. You go to other suburbs and it might be 50 or 60, 70%. That's where disadvantage will be entrenched unless we do something serious about what's happening in our schools. OK, we had a couple of people with their hands up. The gentleman over there had his hand up. We'll just get a microphone to you. Hang on. Take 1 second there. OK, go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. To show a struggle, you need to have a protagonist and a foil, you know, someone struggling against something. And this show clearly was devoid of a political context and some of the area disadvantage that comes from living in the area and having the postcode and applying for jobs and never receiving a reply or even the dignity of a response as to whether your application was received. And, you know, we can't legislate for... governments can't demand that we love people, right? And, you know, we won't make poverty history until we make it a personal issue. Now, here's my question. Do you think that the documentary makers have helped advance the and increase empathy for people in my neighbourhood, or do you think they've set it back again?
Let me quickly ask you, you were in the documentary, were you? I'm just being told in my earpiece anyway.
I worked for Urban Neighbours of Hope, an NGO that's based in the same neighbourhood that Margaret Bell is based in. So over the 6 to 7 months that it was being filmed, I came into contact with the filmmakers and the producers, as well as knowing many of the families
and
involved.
Did you've seen it, did you regret being involved or helping them in any way?
I was deeply disappointed at the promises that were made around breaking stereotypes when all I saw was reinforcing of stereotypes and the selective editing and cutting the most vulnerable people in our society out of a process that we all take for granted, which is what parts of ourselves we present forward to the world. OK.
Clive Palmer, we haven't heard from you. You've been listening to this very carefully. I'm sure you've seen the documentary.
Well, I guess the cost of educating someone from year 1 to year 12 is only equivalent to 1 year's unemployment. A good education is not just a good social policy, it's a good economic policy too. We've got to have our politicians realise that and realise that the work that these people are doing are fundamental to ensuring that we have a successful Australia tomorrow. Until politicians realise the real cost of 1 year's unemployment, the tragedy it brings to Australians, they'll have to realise that and get the message and realise that education is fundamental to stopping that from happening. That's why your work's so important, and that's why Chillaput is going to go back to Canberra and see if you can reverse that decision.
All right. On the question of jobs, we actually have a question that we'll go to same area. Petty Moaga. Petty, there you go.
As seen on Struggle Street last week, there is great evidence of systematic failures for Mount Druitt, and I'm sure in other parts of Western Sydney, one of which is these chosen job agencies that are chosen by the government for people to go and look for jobs. Most of these agencies are just calling people in to fill in forms to satisfy requirements from Centrelink, or simply just ticking the box for them. My question is, how do we help these people that were shown that continuously going to these job agencies? Will government come up with easier and more accessible solutions to
Christian Porter.
failure?
You can see actually one of the things you do see in the documentary, because it's not all bad in terms of what... I mean, yes, the things that you're seeing are bad, but there are some lessons that come out of it, and one of them is how poorly the job agencies seem to be working.
Yeah, look, I'm not entirely sure I drew that from it. I mean, the job agencies that you're talking about that partner with government have some great successes. They're reputable agencies. They're working in, obviously and self-evidently, a very difficult field. But I think the basic answer to your question is that, and it goes to what Clive was saying, that what is very important for our economy is growth. Growth in small business, job creation, and trying to incentivise as much behaviour that allows businesses to invest, expand and employ, and particularly small businesses, which are going to have a penetration into communities like the one that was the subject of that documentary. I mean, everything flows from having an economic plan to drive growth, and I think one of the things you'll see in this budget tomorrow is some very sharp focus, particularly in the small business sector.
We're getting some sharp focus tonight on elements of the budget that aren't widely talked about. Let's hear from Nakkiah.
Well, yeah, that's the thing is that for unemployment there needs to be jobs and there needs to be an economy. And what we love to do in outer suburbs is make it personal. And so that these people are on welfare because they're lazy or because of their own inability. We don't make it political. When you look at, let's say, regional areas, I do believe the National Party, out of the 20 electorates with the highest unemployment, the National Party has 4 of those, and that's out of their 9 electorates. That's almost half. We say that it's a political issue, right? We put money into those communities to create an economy and to create jobs. But yet when it comes to the outer suburbs of many cities, and in this case, looking at Mount Druitt, there's no economy there. And Christian, you just said, let's not take a show like Struggle Street and make policy decisions on it. Let's take a discourse that's happening from a show like Struggle Street. Listen to the people who have come here today to say we need money put back into our communities because we have low unemployment, because resources are being taken away from the generation of the children. High unemployment, yeah, because we have high unemployment, because we don't have the resources there to get at kids an education. They're saying, discuss this with us. So I feel that our government should actually be making policy decisions based on the discourse that's coming from these people in a community who are shouting out for your help.
I'll quickly go to Stephen Barley is the Mayor of Blacktown, and of course you're the public face of the opposition to the documentary. You sent your garbage trucks to blockade SBS at one point there. But listening to the discussion that's happening here and what Nakkiah is saying, is it possible that some positives are going to come out of this and that people are actually focusing on this issue or the range of issues? You probably wouldn't be here now having this discussion were it not for the documentary.
Well, that part's true, but unfortunately, as everyone's been talking about, there's actually no depth to this film. We don't need people's pity, we want solutions. And if you go back and picking up on what Clive was saying, and quite rightly, as far as Margaret Bell here from Mount Druitt Learning Grounds and Martin and Scott here from Eagle Raps, each student that goes through their school only costs the taxpayer $2,000 a year. That's a hell of a lot cheaper than what the school system goes. Now, I don't say every student needs to go to these centres, but to a large extent, they have real solutions in taking children that have fallen out of the school system to get them back on their feet and get them the HSC and get them back into the system. This whole show, the way when we had our 2-hour discussion with SBS, was all around saying, have a look at the agencies and put some context to it. You know, challenge what was actually said in that program. They were almost like, you know, one-dimensional, two-dimensional cartoon characters, the way they came across. And it didn't actually show the great detail and work that Petter and Ashley do for their local community. You know, there's a lot of mental health issues. There's health issues in general and a range of other issues that were raised, homelessness, and they just like, you know, showed it and without any real respect for the characters. They destroyed people's personalities and their families, and then they just left them out to ridicule.
I think I'm just a little concerned about the talk, and I don't want to be unsympathetic here. And I'm not saying that I'm trying to give you pity when you want solutions, but there's a lot of the talk here that suggests that solutions are pretty easy. That all you need to do is, you know, come up with a bit of money and fund here and fund there, and a lot of these problems will go away. Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, you can always do things a lot better, but it's certainly not for want of trying, and it's certainly not for a lot of, you know, work and effort. And sometimes those programs aren't particularly effective. Sometimes they do have to be culled, and sometimes we spend a lot of money in education which is wasted. So I guess I'm just concerned about the idea that all we need to do is have the government come up with solutions to this.
people actually produce outcomes. We're talking about, like Eagles Rap, something like 120 children have fallen out of the school system, would be unemployed, unemployable. They've turned them around and gave them a HSC, or not been gave it, they studied, they did it through O10 learning, self-learning, and create a future for themselves. Yeah, that's only, what, $2,000 a head?
No, of course,
and
of course there's programs like that that you can argue should absolutely be supported, should be reassessed, that there's been mistakes in cutting them off. But I think there's just a more general kind of view that's being put here, that somehow it just means that the government can give more money and borrow more money, or I don't know, cut something from somewhere, or tax somebody somewhere else, and everything will be fixed.
But it's a question of, I suppose what these people are saying is a question of priorities. And if something's working, why defund it?
Well, sure.
So, I mean, we don't know why those decisions were taken.
I'm not going to argue
perhaps,
that,
perhaps Christian Porter can help us explain why those decisions were taken to cut those programs.
Well, look, I mean, there's a competitive tender process. So whether something is working or another thing is working better, or something new needs to be tried because the problem's changing and evolving. I mean, and this goes back to the very fundamental discussion that we started off with, is that other than taxing people more or going further into debt, governments have to be able to reprioritise expenditure inside their own budgets to try and find better solutions to problems that exist, and these solutions are often quite intractable. Now, I don't know the exact details of the organisations that you've been running, but I do think it's fair that
do you think you might spend some time trying to find out who they are?
I'll no doubt have a talk
take
with
this back to the Prime Minister, and you are his Parliamentary Secretary.
I'll no doubt have a talk with the relevant Minister about it. But government has to be able, inside a portfolio area or a departmental budget, to go to open tender, to look at those service providers that are the most efficient and doing the best job, and to reprioritise expenditure. I mean, all governments have to be able to do that. Local government does that.
Well, Stephen Barley, briefly, because we've got another question to get to, but the question about tenders, is that correct, that there was a tender process and...
No, the entire program was just wiped out. But is the government's priority to put $1 million into a crappy so-called documentary, or is it to refund these organisations?
All right.
$1 million would go better into these organisations.
That was not a government decision, but an SBS decision, I think. We've got time for one last question. It's a different subject. We've got very little time left. It's from Mike Phillips.
Thanks, Tony. And may I just say, I think you guys are lucky that Channel 9 didn't do the programme. Climate change.
They might have renovated all their houses.
Good one. OK, climate change is a hoax led by the United Nations so that it can end democracy and impose authoritarian rule. Or so says Maurice Newman, who is the Prime Minister's chief business advisor. Now, Newman isn't a scientist. He's a well-known climate change denier. He's renowned for making similarly wacky comments quite frequently. So my question to the panel members is, do you think that people with views like Newman's should be allowed anywhere within a mile of the Prime Minister?
Clive Palmer.
Well, I think living in a democracy, it's a matter for the Prime Minister's judgment on who he associates and why he associates for various people. And that may give you a reflection of what sort of Prime Minister he is and what he stands for. Of course, climate change is real. It's right throughout the world. Whether we believe it's fake or not, we have to comply with it because we're part of the international community. And we've seen recently our party got the government to introduce a parliamentary inquiry to bring back an environmental trading scheme. The Climate Change Authority is doing that. And of course, it's a question of judgment. You don't have advisors. Normally your advisors in politics are people that tend to agree with you.
Christian Porter.
Look, I don't share Mr Newman's particular concerns, but I would say that we're a country where you have your views and you can speak them freely. I mean, there was a fellow not that long ago who believed that there should be a world government voted on a one vote, one value basis by all Earthians. And he spent a bit of time in the Senate quite close to the PM, so, it takes all types.
Yes, but he wasn't advising the Prime Minister on business matters.
No, he was making fundamental decisions that affect us all in our nation through holding the balance of power in the Senate. And his views were kooky.
Nakkiah.
I'd just like to ask Maurice Newman if Elvis is actually dead or if he's just gone home. Was the moon landing faked?
He's left the building.
It's an abuse of power. You have a man up there, he has a responsibility as the business advisor to Tony Abbott. I mean, this is the business advisor to Tony Abbott making decisions about our economy. No wonder Joe Hockey is, like, looking scared. But it's an abuse. He has a responsibility to purport fact. This is an outright lie. It's a conspiracy theory that's up there with playing Beyonce records backwards has satanic verses. I mean, it's actually ridiculous, and it's quite embarrassing that he's saying this. I don't know, I haven't tried. I haven't played a record in ages. But it's
Christian,
it's
was he joking? I mean, is it possible there's a let-out clause here that it was a bit of stand-up comedy or something?
Look, I think that some of the reporting of what he actually said was probably slightly hyperbolic, I must say. But look, as I say, it's not a view that I share. But
you did write it in an article, though, didn't he?
Yes, he did. But I think the secondary reporting of it made it sound a lot worse than it was, if I can put it that way.
How did you interpret it?
Well, I interpret it as a person who has a grave concern about the notion of a world government, which some people advocate for.
You don't agree, though?
No.
OK. Jennifer Hewett.
Well, I'd say that Maurice Newman is very lucky in that he gives great solace to all Tony Abbott's many critics when he makes comments like that, and I certainly don't think it helps the Prime Minister, even if it may be unfairly interpreted.
Jason Clare.
Well, Tony Abbott talks about absolute crap when he talks about climate change.
No, to be fair...
he says climate change is absolute crap. What Maurice Newman said is absolute crap. And what frustrates the hell out of me is that we're still having this debate about whether climate change is real or not. It's real. We should be focusing on what we need to do about it.
That is all we have time for tonight, and so hold your applause. Please thank our panel, Clive Palmer, Christian Porter, Nakkiah Louis, Jennifer Hewett and Jason Clare. Thank you. Now, over the next few days, you'll be bombarded with budget politics. So next Monday, take a break and join Q&A with the leading minds of the Sydney Writers' Festival. Canadian novelist and artist Douglas Copeland, the man who coined the term Generation X and whose latest book is a guide to the extreme present. Renowned researcher Norman Doidge, whose book The Brain That Changes Itself popularised the idea of neuroplasticity. Funeral worker Caitlin Doughty, who's written a memoir from the crematorium entitled Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. Yes, that's true. Pakistani-born global citizen Mohsin Hamid, the author of The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and foreign correspondent Christina Lamb, who's best known as co-author of I Am Malala. It's a great lineup, and we're expecting a fascinating conversation until next week's Q&A. Good night.